Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. In his own lifetime, Baruch Spinoza only published one major work, titled the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, often referred to as the TTP for short. An immensely influential and controversial book, it lays out Spinoza's epoch-defining views on major questions of religion and politics, and has for centuries been seen as one of the major works that laid the groundwork for modern secularism and political liberalism. Today we shall be exploring the massively controversial ideas within the TTP, and especially the ways in which Spinoza radically reinterprets major concepts of the Jewish religion in line with his philosophy. This episode is the second in our mini-series on Spinoza, and we are delighted today to welcome here Dr. Yitzhak Melamed, who is the professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University. He has published numerous books and articles on elements of both Jewish and Western philosophy, and is the co-editor of a critical guide to Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, published by Cambridge University Press in 2010. It is a pleasure for us to welcome Professor Melamed to the podcast of Jewish Ideas today.
Thank you, JJ. It's my pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So, although we have already done one episode on Spinoza's general philosophy, it would be helpful if you could perhaps briefly sum up, at least as you see it, the major foundations of Spinoza's general worldview, especially as it pertains to matters of theology and religion, before we jump into the TTP specifically.
Okay. Well, the issue is that there are different Spinozas. I mean, and there are different Spinozas in the sense that there are different interpretations of Spinoza. I read Spinoza as actually a pretty radical religious philosopher. So I don't read him as an atheist. I think that in order to read him as an atheist, you need to be thoroughly ignorant and blind of the Jewish philosophical tradition. So once you are aware of the works of figures like the Maimonides and his Guide to the Perplexed and panentheism in mainstream Kabbalah, I think that views like Spinoza, which are extremely non-mainstream, but still strongly religious views, are going to be seen in a very different light. So I see Spinoza as a panentheist, someone who conceives God to be as completely having no anthropomorphic qualities. So if you combine something like Maimonides' anti-anthropomorphism together with the panentheism of the Kabbalah, you get something not far from Spinoza.
Excellent. Can I ask you briefly, just for the benefit of our audience, to define panentheism?
Sure.
It's one of these terms that is often trotted out by those in the field, but perhaps less familiar to the general audience.
Pantheism is usually taken to be the claim that God and the world, the God and nature, are identical. I think panentheism, the more, I think the better understanding is the view that basically nature does not exhaust God. So nature is in God, the world is in God, but there are aspects of God, or if God has parts, there are parts of God that are beyond nature and beyond what we consider as nature.
And you believe that Spinoza was not a pantheist, but a panentheist, in your view?
Yes.
Interesting. So when he says something, or for the off-quoted line about Spinoza, or the aphorism that he's often attributed to, is God or nature.
That's right. But when you look carefully, you see that Spinoza tell you pay attention to the fact that you can use nature in two different senses. So sometimes you use nature just as a reference to what we would call extended nature or the physical universe. If that's what you mean by nature, then no, God and nature are not the same. God has infinitely many attributes way beyond anything that you associate with the physical universe. Spinoza's God. So there is here simple equivocation in the term nature. It can be understood as what we would normally say, what we would normally call the physical universe, or the physical plus the mental universe. But if you use nature in this Spinozist sense of something having infinitely many kinds of existence, then yes, in this sense, Spinoza's God and nature are the same. But again, it will be only if you're going. You see, my dog agrees. It's only if you are going to take that. If you are going to take nature in this very Spinozist sense of the term.
Right. So let's turn to the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the book itself. So could you perhaps walk us a little bit through its background, the composition history, when in Spinoza's life it was written, for whom it was written, and essentially why he wrote this book?
Right. So broadly speaking, there are two main theories about how this book was written. The debate is really related to the question whether it was written, if you wish, Megillot, or just one sermon after sermon, or was it really written in the time that we have testimony of Spinoza just working on this book from 1665 till 1669. So we have letters from September 1665 in which Spinoza is saying, I'm working now on a new tractate. That's roughly the time that we know that Spinoza begins, at least to some extent, working on this book. And by the end of 1669, 4 years later, he probably sent the book to the publisher. However, several scholars, including Zev Harvey, Ed Curley, and others, suggested that it's possible that Spinoza incorporated earlier text into the work. There is some support for this claim because the title of the book speaks about several dissertations, which seems to refer to some sort of collection of texts. So it's possible, again, I cannot be sure, but it's definitely possible that the work was basically relying on some earlier manuscripts that were incorporated together. If that was the case, then of course the introduction is playing a huge role, because the introduction is providing the raison d'etre for the inclusion and the creation of the work as a unified work. Why is he writing that? Well, we have plenty of claims of Spinoza. I mean, so in 1665, when he's writing the letter explaining or telling us that he starts working on this work, I think that he refers to three reasons for writing the book. One is the prejudices of the theologian, that he is trying to address them. Second, he is trying to get rid of a certain reputation of being an atheist, which he thinks is absolutely wrong, and he wishes to just address this reputation. In brackets, I can tell you that Spinoza probably had some sort of very problematic perception of reality, because if he thought that the TTP will actually save him from having a reputation of being an atheist, they probably, he didn't understand his audience. I mean, that was really a kind of a poor judgment of poor understanding of reality. The third aim that Spinoza presents for himself for writing the TTP is the separation of philosophy from theology. He's basically wishing to create some sort of free space in which philosophy can be pursued without being hampered by considerations or checks or supervision by theology. So that's basically the three main official reasons for writing the book. I think that there were additional agendas for Spinoza, and I think I'll open my cards. I think for Spinoza, eventually there were too many agendas in writing the book, and that's why the book, at the end of the day, failed. I mean, I think that it is the reason why Spinoza, after publishing the book, he starts working on a new book called the Political Treatise, which he left unfinished by the time he died in 1677. And this new book is an attempt to address many of the issues that were discussed in the Theological Political Treatise, just without getting into all the problems that he was addressing in the TTP.
Right. Interesting. I want to press you there a little bit on what you mean by the differentiation of philosophy from theology, or the relationship between them, because that really is one of the major foundations, not only of the TTP, but of Spinoza's philosophy in general. Because for centuries during the medieval period, of course, philosophy was treated by many, especially within the scholastic tradition, as what they call the handmaiden of theology. In other words, philosophy was a discipline practiced because it was useful to discussing fine points of theology, and that's how it was practiced by many religious thinkers. So in Spinoza's eyes, what was the correct relationship between philosophy and theology, or between reason and, say, revelation or received tradition?
I think that the official view that Spinoza presents, and to a large extent, I think he's also pursuing this view. He wishes to have a complete separation between the two, so much so that almost it would be they will almost should be irrelevant to each other. The aim of philosophy is truth. The aim of theology is obedience or proper behavior towards other human beings. Truth might not lead to obedience, or at least that's at least in some cases, and obedience might need not rely on true beliefs. So he's really interested in complete separation. I would stress, however, that I think that for Spinoza, religion has an important role in society and in the state, because he believes that philosophy is not available to most human beings. So if you're interested in having a society that works harmoniously without violence, without violent compulsion, religion provides an extremely important tool for creating harmonious and or I don't know even harmonious, but a society in which people do not kill each other every other day.
Right. Not that religion has done a fantastic job necessarily all the time on this particular point, but
Of course not, but and I think he's aware of that. But on the other hand, you can see him basically saying, "Listen, what are the alternatives?" So the alternative is just to use the compulsion of the state. He's afraid of that. I mean, I think that if he were to watch our state, liberal democracy, he would say there is too much violence used by the state. He thought that he can actually bypass this use of violence by creating some sort of state religion. I know it's naive, but that's roughly the view that he was. And this kind of state religion would help reconcile tensions within society by suggesting some sort of common aims or something like that.
Fascinating. But in terms of reaching the truth, in terms of having access to what is correct about the world and what is not correct about the world, is it fair to say that Spinoza saw philosophy as standing entirely alone?
Basically, yes. Although, sometimes he cannot stop himself, and occasionally he will appeal to all kinds of passages in the Bible, say, okay, these passages are actually supporting my view. So it will be Ecclesiastics. I mean, he will appeal to that quite a lot. And it's bizarre because he's not supposed to do that. I mean, the Bible is not supposed to be a book of philosophy. That's one of the main principles, I think, of his work. But still, I think sometimes he's simply tempted, and he has too many agendas and too many temptations. And as a result, he's undermining a lot of times his own claims.
Right. It is interesting, just in general, as a sort of, can I say, a more amateur reader of Spinoza than yourself, who's a full-time scholar in the field. I've often noticed for someone who is supposed to be such a threat to religion, one can read Spinoza often as someone who's almost obsessed with trying to get religion on his side, or trying to ground his ideas in the canonical works or theories of the received religions in their day, which is an astonishing thing for someone who is at the same time trying to undermine these ideas, but also trying to base himself in those ideas at the same time.
That's right. Well, I think both points. I mean, first of all, Spinoza generally is an obsessive figure. I mean, you don't see that so much in the TTP, in my mind. But if you look at the ethics and you see his discussion of emotions, you just see an OCD in full bloom. And the same would also be true about the political work that he's going to write later in life. I mean, the political treatise, which begins with 3 chapters on the emotions. And again, they are very systematic. I mean, basically giving you the precise formula of each human emotion. So yes, I mean, obsession is part of the story.
So let's jump into one of the most extraordinary things about the TTP, because anyone who reads this Tractatus will notice that one of the major things that Spinoza does is redefinitions. Okay, because adherents of a classical religion, in this particular case Judaism, because the TTP really does spend most of its time analyzing and trying to deconstruct Judaism, there are certain principles or certain concepts or ideas at the heart of the Jewish religion. And what Spinoza tends to do is not deny these concepts outright, but deny the general or the classic definitions given to these concepts, or the classic way in which they've been understood. So he tries to preserve the concept, but in a completely different way as is normally understood by that concept, right? So I'd like to focus on 2 such concepts. I think that they're most important, which Spinoza radically redefines. The first is chosenness, and the second is miracles or the nature of miracles. I think that his redefinition of both of them is very, very important, very germane to his philosophy. So could you perhaps speak? How does Spinoza re-understand the notion of the Jewish people as chosen?
Right. So let's take the notion of chosenness, and I think that's a good example. It's in some way it's better, I think, than the issue of miracles. In the case of chosenness, I mean, Spinoza basically will tell his readers that being chosen is not the Jews actually. For Spinoza, Jews are actually chosen. I mean, there are things they were extremely fortunate, and that's because they had a state with political constitution that was pretty lousy. So if you had a good political constitution, you do not need miracles. Spinoza's view would basically, at least in chapter 3, will say, you know what, I mean, I grant you that you had miracles, but that's not something that I would be proud of. I mean, because if you had a good constitution, you would not need miracles. The fact that you were saved just by virtue of fortune and miracles indicates that the constitution of your state was actually very problematic. Now, it's interesting because in later chapters, in chapter 17, he's actually having quite a lot of praises for the ancient Hebrew state. But in chapter 3, on the other hand, he's basically saying, I'm totally agree with you. Actually, I will radicalize your claim. It's a greater miracle than you would expect. But that's only an indication that your constitution, political constitution, was really lousy.
Right. The problem that Spinoza seems to be facing is that he seems to want to defend a form of chosenness for the Jews, or at least agree that the concept could exist, but doesn't agree that there is a being that could do the choosing, as it were. In other words, you have to rethink what it means. If there is no conscious divine agent to do choosing, then what does it mean to be chosen? Who is doing the choosing?
I think that there is a conscious divine agent this is doing, but it doesn't have free will.
I see.
In the same way that I'm choosing and I don't have free will. So there are processes that are happening in nature which are sometimes are going to benefit one person, rather other times are going to benefit another person. It happened that the Jews were saved many times, despite the fact that they didn't have a very good political constitution, according to Spinoza. And he will say they were fortunate. Now, the truth is that he has a little bit more than that to say, but that's slightly in a different context where he'll say, he's trying to understand why the Jews survived. And he said, well, anti-Semitism is one of the reasons. Then he thinks that, for example, the issue of the circumcision of the Milah is an important reason for their survival. Not a great explanation to my mind, but whatever. Let's go to the issue of miracles. And here, to be honest, I think that his views are not that crazy. I mean, the view that belief based on miracles is problematic is a view that you find in the Rambam, right? I mean, the Maimonides in Mishneh Torah will tell you, "Ma'amin al pi ot yesh bo dofi." So there is a problem with the, and Spinoza's argument, quite interestingly, will say you have a much better proof for the existence of God if you have laws of nature which are necessary and are unbroken, because then you have to explain this necessity. Necessity cannot be brought unexplained. If you have strictly necessary laws of nature, there must be something that will explain the source of this necessity. And he thinks that it can only be explained by a being which he would call having an essence involving existence, or what he would call God. So, yes, he will deny miracles in the sense of breaking laws of nature, but the motivation is not necessarily anti-religious. Now, I totally agree with the point that you were making about redefinitions, and actually a lot of times these kind of redefinitions are also involving certain sardonic or ironic elements. And in spite of the fact that it does not discuss Christianity significantly, at least apart from one chapter in the TTP, there is something very interesting that is happening when he is coming to discuss Paul, because Paul is his favorite biblical figure in many ways. I think he likes him more than any figure, more than Moses, more than Solomon. But there is a trade-off. And the trade-off that Spinoza basically converts Paul into Spinozism. And he's basically systematically reinterprets not only the Hebrew Bible, but every single claim of Paul. He will basically show you that Paul actually believed in what Spinoza believes. And this process gets to its zenith, to its culmination, in one of Spinoza's late letters, where he will tell you that Paul, just like Spinoza, did not believe in the resurrection in the flesh, but only in the spirit, which means that Christ was not really resurrected, but only spiritually or allegorically.
So I suppose that would mean that the kind of violence that Spinoza does to the classical Jewish concepts, he also was happy to do to classic Christian concepts as well.
Oh, even more so, at least at the end of his life. Yes, of course. I mean, what he's doing to the doctrine of the resurrection towards the end of his life, this is basically letters from the last year of his life, or one before last, is quite astonishing, because he's doing precisely what he is criticizing in Maimonides' interpretation of the Bible. So Spinoza generally, in the TTP, criticizes Maimonides for trying to push the Bible towards allegorical interpretation in order to avoid all kinds of irrational claims that he finds in the Bible if they inconsistent with philosophy. And when towards the end of his life, Spinoza is confronted with questions about what is his view about the resurrection of Christ. He'll say it's an allegory, nothing more than that. He doesn't have anything more interesting to say. He'll say, so that it might be the case that some people believe that they saw Christ arising from the dead, and in the same way, he'll say Abraham believed that he saw angels. If you wish to address the text genuinely in a systematic manner, you have to claim that it's a simple allegory, nothing more than that.
Interesting. But the thing is that Spinoza, at least in the TTP, he's not satisfied with merely saying, oh, when it says a miracle, it's allegorical, because he goes into depth into some of the miracles in the Bible and tries to, provide the scientific, explain how it was scientific. So, for example, the miracle of the sun standing still for Joshua's army. Firstly, what is he doing? And secondly, why is he doing it?
Nice. Yeah. So I never thought about it before, but he's actually doing in these places, he's employing the kind of argumentation that is very typical of his also in his other works in the ethics. So Spinoza a lot of times is trying to argue for P, but then because many of his arguments are clearly surprising, unusual, if you wish, or iconoclastic. So he's spending also a lot of time not only in order to establish the claim that P is the case, but he will also explain why everyone else apart from him believes that not P. And so he's trying to provide a theory of error for most of his major claims, especially in the ethics. So whenever he's trying to argue he'll argue free will is wrong, but he'll also give you a genealogy of how it happened to be the case that the rest of the world believes in free will. In a bracket comment, I'll tell you that sometimes Spinoza is so much fascinated or interested in this kind of explanations of error that he sometimes forgets to spend the basic time needed in order to make the argument that P is wrong. He's just explaining why everyone else believes in not P. I think that in the cases of the errors that you see in the Bible, it's basically not errors. The cases of explanations of miracles. Spinoza is basically trying to tell you. I'll explain to you why people come to the alternative view. I can give you a natural explanation why people have this view.
Interesting. This, in a way, is also a very Maimonidean technique, I would say.
I agree.
But Rambam does this very often, where he spends an inordinate amount of time explaining the erroneous views before coming back to try and explain his own, and sometimes does that insufficiently.
I agree, and again, I think that in many ways, the Rambam is the most important figure at the background of the TTP. So the second most important figure will be Hobbes, but that's a kind of a more problematic story, because if Spinoza read Leviathan, it was only towards the very end of his time writing the TTP. So he probably read the Kive or something like that, but in the presence of conversations with Maimonides is all over the text.
Interesting. Just to clarify for our listeners, Hobbes and Spinoza were contemporaries, and therefore it is a question, to what extent each one read the other.
Well, yeah. So specifically, the issue is that the Leviathan appeared in 1651 in English.
Hobbes' great work, yes.
Right, but Spinoza's English was quite poor. He had some, but not really good English. It appeared in Dutch in 1667 and in Latin in 1668. And Spinoza sent his manuscript to print in 1669. So he had either a year or two to read the text in either Latin or Dutch. A very short window. So all this being said, it's clear that he read one of Hobbes' earlier works, the Kive, an important work. It's also clear that he read Maimonides very thoroughly, very closely.
Yes, as I'm sure would have been his background, as one of Amsterdam's principal, most promising rabbinical candidates before his excommunication, or for his cherem, to use a technical term. But I wanted to briefly, before moving on, go back to the chosenness point, because you spoke a lot about the success or otherwise of the ancient Hebrew state, meaning the ancient Israelite commonwealth as described in the Tanakh, as described in the Torah and the other books of the Bible. Why, can you just clarify for us why for Spinoza that was important, or what that had to do with Jewish chosenness, and why the success or otherwise of that would stand at the heart of Jewish understanding or his understanding of Jewish chosenness?
Well, again, Spinoza thinks that there are two kinds of providence. There is a providence that is based on the nature of the individual, and he would call that God's direct aid or kind of direct providence. Then there is providence, which is just not related to the nature of the individual, but rather related to external causes. Either way, it's still the case that God is the cause of all things. So whether something happens to me by virtue of my nature or whether something happens to me by virtue of external causes, it's still God who is the event, the ultimate cause beyond all of those. Okay. Now, when something happens to us by virtue of our nature, we usually think that that's it's not God. And Spinoza will say, no, it is God. I mean, just God is your cause. God is also the cause of your nature. We are really so much enthusiastic when things happen to us which are not by virtue of our nature, just by virtue of external causes. Then we are saying we are fortunate, right? It's not by virtue of what I am doing. And Spinoza will say, yeah, you have cases of fortune. Fortune exists in nature. I mean, it can well be the case that certain people, individuals, or groups are occasionally are having fortune. And we'll say that's what happened in the case of the Jews. I mean, because he thinks that the constitution of the Bible, the constitution was problematic, was not. Especially, I think that he thinks that the election of the tribe of Levi created a lot of tensions within the Hebrew society, and the result was constant fights within the Hebrew state. I'm not sure that it's a kind of theory that has a lot of historical support, but it's Spinoza's own reconstruction.
Right. So to sort of to put it at its most basic level, for Spinoza, because there is no, let's say, like direct personal chosenness as is imagined in the Bible, so we have to understand that as the success of the ancient Hebrews in creating a state indicates their excellence and therefore their chosenness, meaning their chosenness in terms of being able to flourish, I suppose, is God's chosenness. And therefore, and what you're saying is that it seems to me that Spinoza is saying, well, either they could have flourished due to their own excellence or due to happenstance and fortune, either of which is from God and either of which can be seen as chosenness. But the latter is, of course, a far less praiseworthy and a far less desirable form of chosenness.
Right. And Spinoza will argue none of this is a result of God's loving or hating anyone.
Right.
Because God loves no one, God hates no one. And of course, you will say, what a view. Well, I think that's also, at the end of the day, that's also the view of the guide.
Right.
When you look carefully at the guide, I mean, the God of Maimonides, at the end of the day, loves no one, hates no one.
Interesting. Which it's funny because lumping Rambam in with Spinoza for some people would be, for many I think would be scandalous, and for others would at the end of the day be praiseworthy, either for Maimonides or Spinoza, depending on who you're asking. In other words, fans of Spinoza might say, "Oh well, I suppose Rambam was one of us," or vice versa.
JJ, to make your point stronger, lumping the Rambam with the Rambam will also be scandalous for many. As you know, there is a famous story of Rabbi Yaakov Emdin that was asking Efer Trei Rambam Habe, right? I mean, the one who wrote the horrible Guide to the Perplexed and the one who wrote the wonderful Mishneh Torah. Turn out it's the same person.
Yes, one of the major puzzles at the heart of Maimonides studies. I remember my teacher Menachem Kellner once wrote an article titled "Could Maimonides get into Rambam's heaven?" which is puts that well, I think.
Well, no, a wonderful question, and I think that you have another nice article about whether Spinoza would allow the publication of his TTP,
Right.
by a colleague of mine named Dan Garber. I mean, I think it's a wonderful piece. Yeah.
It's amazing, by the way. Somehow, all our episodes here on this podcast manage to wind their way back to the Rambam. It's almost infuriating how his shadow lurks so heavily over future Jewish thinkers that were debating Spinoza, but also debating the extent to which he was a Maimonidean. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, when you have a figure that is at the same time one of the most important rabbinic authors and one of the most heretics, one of the most important heretics within Jewish tradition, then you have an explosion, and there is no question that this explosion will be heard for centuries after
Right.
that.
Fascinating. I want to dive into another part of the TTP, which is the element of the analysis of the Bible, what the Hebrew Bible is, what the Hebrew Bible isn't. And Spinoza has been given the title sometimes as the founding father of biblical criticism, or modern, studies, modern ideas on the Bible based not on religious tradition and ideas, but rather based on a dispassionate analysis of the text, or a critical view of what the Bible is, and created in human terms. So, I mean, I guess general questions on it. What were the major claims he was making? What was the methodology he was using? And is it justified to say he was the founding father or the major figure at the base of modern biblical criticism?
Let me begin in the inverse order. I don't think he was the founding father of biblical criticism because there is a political agenda there. It's not a pure Wissenschaft. I mean, he is in some places. I mean, usually his official doctrine is that you should read the Bible literally, stick to the literal meaning. But when it is needed, I mean, Spinoza will actually depart significantly from the literal meaning. And for example, when he is trying to catch the moral meaning of the Bible, he will depart very strongly. I mean, he will make all kinds of claims. For example, that all the prophets taught the very same simple morality, without any disagreement among them about simple morality. It's a difficult claim to sustain in the face of a literal reading of the Bible. So he has an agenda, and he's using the Bible for certain purposes. He's extremely penetrating reader, and he had great tools. We now have we can actually look at the tools that he was using when he was writing the TTP. I mean, we can look at his library. There are quite a few dictionaries, thesaurus that he's using in order to in order to write this work. I will also add that I'm not sure that it was in his interest to criticize the some of the traditional claims about the Bible, because he wants to keep the Bible as a book of a certain authority, at least to some degree, because he is interested in having some sort of religion that is going to help the masses achieve salvation. And the Bible is definitely a possibility for such a book. So he might, it might have been one of these places where he was actually undermining his own aims by attacking some elements in the Bible. This being said, of course, you can see that he sees the Christian preachers around, the Calvinist preachers around, and he wished to tell them, listen, I mean, if you're reading the Bible and you're believing in the literal meaning of everything, then you find out all kinds of bizarre things. You find out that sometimes people refer to Ever Ayarden when the perspective of the person who is using this name is a perspective of someone who should not be able to use the term Ever Ayarden, because Ever Ayarden means someone who is living from inside the land of Israel, right? And Moses, when he was apparently speaking about that, is not inside the land of Israel. So how can Moses use the term Ever Yarden when he is not living inside the land of Israel? So there are many expressions like that you have in the Bible that seems to indicate that the person, for example, is in some distance in space or time from the period in which the text narrates. And by the way, Spinoza was not the first to see that. I mean, we have Ibn Ezra. We have also Yehuda Chassid, who is actually having quite a few observations that are similar to that. And of course, we have Chazal. I think when you look at Chazal's discussion of who wrote which book, Baba Batra, and places like that, they're actually quite hesitant. I mean, they're saying probably this one was written by that one, but it's not the kind of crazy dogma that you have that you'll find among all kinds of Calvinist preachers. Just think about what was written by Moses. Moshe katav sifro Iyov parashat Bilam. What does that mean? Why do you mention parashat Bilam when he wrote sifro? What precisely is going on here? I think that we tend to make a lot of fuss about any kind of questioning about the authorship of biblical texts, but I think that for Chazal, in many ways, there were questions about that. There were genuine questions,
and of course the final 8 verses of the Torah when Moshe dies, and they have to. Well, who wrote that? Was it Yeshua? Was it?
And I think that it's just there is something pretty bizarre about modern secular scholars who are thinking that people were not aware of these problems. So if you look at the Cambridge Companion to Spinoza from 1996, you have a scholar by the name of Richard Popkin that claims that Ibn Ezra was the first to realize that the last verses of the Chumash could not have been written by Moshe. And then he has a footnote that Amos Funkenstein mentioned to him that there is a medieval midrash in Masechet Baba Bukra. I mean, it's a misspelled Baba Batra, that Moshe was writing while weeping, something like that. Yes, it's not serious. I mean, it's really not serious. I mean, the last verses of the Pentateuch are some of the most read verses ever, right? I mean, you read it in Simchat Torah time and again and again and again. You cannot not realize that there is a problem with these verses. I mean, if there is any verse that you just face time and again and again and again, you realize something is going on there. Every Jew reads these verses, I don't know how many times a year. I mean, I don't know how it happens in your shul, but in mine, I mean, I think I read it, usually I hear it at least 10 or 12 times on Simchat Torah. So awareness of these issues was there.
Oh, certainly. What is interesting, I mean, Spinoza, okay, to sort of defend maybe the idea, Spinoza really seems to be the first to lay out the case very first at length, and secondly with lots of examples. In other words, you're right that you have within Ibn Ezra and Yehuda Chassid, you have indications. Ibn Ezra will talk about the Sod HaShnei Masar, the secret of the 12, and drop light hints to the possibility that parts of Sefer Dvarim, let's say, as you say, appear to have been written later or appear to have been written already in Eretz Israel, which would contravene the idea that Moshe wrote it, and it sort of drops delicate hints. But Spinoza, I mean, he attacks this with a battering ram. He, lays out a very lengthy case for the possibility that those who seem to have written the books in the Bible aren't those who actually wrote the books in the Bible. This does seem to be different. There seems to be a sea change here.
I think you are right, and I will add that I think that he should have not done that.
Okay, interesting. Why?
Because it's undermining his entire project in the TTP. I mean, so what you get? So yes, you'll be able to undermine some Calvinist preachers. Okay, fine, but you still wish to have people relate to the Bible or another text. But the Bible is definitely a major candidate as a holy text. So why undermine it?
And if you're correct in saying that Spinoza values viewing the Bible as a holy text, an important holy text, is that, as you say, simply because of political expedience, that it helps people behave themselves? But really, Spinoza believes that actual truth is not to be, or truths about the world are to be best found through the philosophical method.
So he thinks that the Bible is a text that is useful for convincing lay people to behave in a manner that they treat each other and love each other and live life in a decent manner. That's a lot, but that's but there is no need for that to cover anything true or anything like that. I think that he would say the same is also true about the Quran. And I don't know if you can find other books. I mean, he will say we have no problem with that, but he thinks that you cannot actually get rid of the religious element, and he thinks that it must be there because otherwise you're going to lose something like 95% of human society.
Right. And so, therefore, you think that perhaps he was unwise in laying out a strong case for the Bible being a much later composition than it seems to be, because, let me put it a different way. We mentioned Maimonides before. For Maimonides, there is a very strong correlation between the historicity of the Torah, specifically of the Tanakh and the Torah, and its sort of religious force. Right. Therefore, he makes it one of his 13 principles that every single word in the 5 books of Moses was written, in fact, by Moses, dictated to by God. In other words, for him, you can't draw the distinction, because if the books weren't written by Moses, if they were in fact written later, well, why should surely they wouldn't hold the same force, they wouldn't be as they wouldn't hold the same obligations, let's say, as they were if they were in fact written by who the Bible says it was, and dictated to from by God, whatever Maimonides means by that precisely. It seems that Spinoza, at least the way you're presenting him, doesn't hold that, because on the one hand he does want to retain the authority of the Bible, but on the other hand, he doesn't seem to have a problem in playing around with its historicity, or at least undermining the traditional view of when it was written and where and by whom.
So yes, I think that's correct. He's appealing to the authority of the Bible on many occasions, basically saying, "Here's a verse." I mean, so here's a verse confirming my view, and that's actually one of the modes of the argumentation throughout the TTP. He'll give you a rational argument, and then an argument according to Scripture. Very medieval style of argumentation form that you find in the Ravad, in Maimonides, whatever. That's on the other hand, he's also undermining this very practice, and I think that's I don't know whether it was a matter of ego on Spinoza's side, because he wanted to show that he's better off than everyone around. I mean, he definitely knew the Bible very well. That's true. I would only just add some small reservation. I mean, with regard to the 13 principles, at least I'm on my side, the fact that 13 principles are not included in the Guide to the Perfect.
Right. I'll just bring it as an example, meaning, yes, correct. There remains an active question as to whether Maimonides, the extent to which Maimonides held to those 13 principles throughout his own writings, and yes.
Right. As you know, a common joke among Maimonides scholars is that the true question is whether he believes in 7 or only 6 of his 13 principles.
Yes, exactly. Okay, fine. I want to actually move slightly adjacent to another element of Spinoza's possible influences as it's raised in the TTP, from the Jewish side, which is actually Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical traditions, because there's been a rise in scholarship in the last couple of decades that try to link Spinoza's thoughts, Spinoza's ideas and theology to texts and ideas from the Jewish mystical traditions. So I guess my question is twofold. Number one, biographically, to what extent did Spinoza have interaction with Kabbalistic sources? And secondly, do you see within Spinoza's ideas and theologies, especially in the TTP, a hint, or more than a hint, of Kabbalistic traditions?
Okay, we'll do it inversely. The only explicit reference to the Kabbalah in Spinoza's writing, explicit where the word Kabbalah is mentioned, is in the TTP, and it's quite pejorative. It's basically saying, I know the craziness of the Mekubalim. It's especially referring to the issue of Gimatriot. You say, I'm not there. Beyond that, however, I think that there is a very good case for the influence of the Kabbalah on Spinoza. Why? Let's begin with the background. I mean, Spinoza was not a good Talmudist. He knows the Bible very well, but the evidence that we have of him knowing Talmudic literature is very, very weak. He has occasional one reference to Shabbat, one reference to Masechet Sofrim, There is one place where he's supposed to be referring to the text of Masechet Shabbat, but it turned out to be a reference to the Tosfot on Masechet Shabbat. So there are all kinds of bizarre things, but he's not the Talmid Chacham in the sense of someone who is a really great Talmudist. I will only add that generally Amsterdam was not a place for Talmudism. I mean, when Menashe ben Israel decided he wished his son to get proper Talmudic education, he sends his son to Poland, beyond the other side, the dark side of Europe, and hundreds, if not thousands of miles from Netherlands. Amsterdam was a great place for Dikduk, for Hebrew grammar, for Kabbalah. You have Avraham Cohen Herrera, a major Kabbalist that dies when Spinoza is 3 years old, and so there are interesting developments in Kabbalistic thought in Spinoza's time, and Spinoza knows them. How do we know that? First of all, he says that he knows the Kabbalists. Second, we have quite a few Kabbalistic works in his personal library. So I think there are many more Kabbalistic works in his personal library than there are, for example, works of scholasticism. So why are they there, right? What does the Rekanati on the Torah is there? I mean, we have more. I mean, quite thick, several thick volumes of Kabbalistic works in his personal library. So I think that's quite significant. Next to that, we have a letter in which Spinoza is speaking about his views about the relationship between God and nature, and he's saying, my views are different from the views of contemporary Christians. They are like the view of Paul and the view of the ancient Hebrew traditions, which got corrupted. Now, I think that it's quite clear that this ancient Hebrew tradition that got corrupted is a reference to the Kabbalah, because Kabbalah is just traditions. That's what the word Kabbalah means. And the view of the Kabbalah is some sort of ancient lore that got corrupted and we cannot understand it anymore is the major image of the Kabbalah, both among Jews and non-Jews in the early modern period. So it's highly likely that the reference there is just to the panentheism of the Kabbalah. Next to that, there is also one passage which I think, as far as I know, no one discussed so far, and I mentioned that in a few recent articles. He has an axiom in what I take to be the first draft of Spinoza's Ethics, in which he claims that God could not have limited itself. I take that, or I suspect that this axiom is Spinoza's own contribution or intervention in the debates about Tzimtzum. I mean, we know that the question of Tzimtzum, Kipshuto or Sheno Kipshuto, whether God really restricted himself or not restricted himself, was going on in Europe at the same time, right? I mean, you have the doctrine of the restriction, God's restriction of himself in Luriani Kabbalah, and then most European interpreters of the Tzimtzum are actually saying that's not a literal, they should not be read literally, because God, at the end of the day, God is present everywhere. And I think Spinoza is aligning himself with this trend, which also dominated the Kabbalah in the Netherlands.
Interesting. So, and those are sort of, I would say, small, or not even so small elements, sort of on the outer edges of Spinoza's philosophy. I'm curious. I mean, Spinoza's, as you described it, panentheism is curious to me, because that is how some would describe the Kabbalistic view of the relationship between God and the universe. Some would say that a mainstream Kabbalistic view, in fact, as it's often expressed in Hasidic thought as well, is that the universe is fundamentally or essentially godly in some way, and that God also exists beyond it, but penetrates and is imbricated deeply within every atom and every single part of a particle in the entire universe as well. So I mean, is it possible to see Spinoza as playing this same game, or is there some essential cutoff between Spinoza and the Kabbalistic tradition?
I think that that's precisely my point. I think he is playing precisely the same game. Now, of course, in the Kabbalah, as you know, there is a huge diversity of opinions. So some Kabbalists will also say they are panentheists, but then the question is whether this the concept of God is anthropomorphic or not. Some Kabbalists will be as radical as Maimonides in terms of denying any kind of anthropomorphic qualities of God. If you take these Kabbalists, the pantheistic, anti-anthropomorphic Kabbalists, and compare them to Spinoza, they are not far away.
Interesting. And how aware of this do you think he was?
Well, I think again, if I'm right about this letter in which he's saying my views are the same, my views about God and nature are the views of the ancient Hebrew tradition that got corrupted, then I think he was well aware of that.
Interesting. This brings me to sort of a question that just occurred to me as you were speaking before, which is that, the TTP is a fascinating work and has been read by centuries, Jews and Christians, etc. Are you aware of readings of the TTP that, almost a Straussian readings that see Spinoza as fundamentally concealing his major project within the work? Because if it is in fact the case that Spinoza knew about the similarities between him and some strains of Jewish mysticism or some strains of the Jewish medieval rationalism, he doesn't, as you said, in the TTP, his only reference to Kabbalah is a very negative and pejorative one. So, could Spinoza be seen as using the TTP to present a certain version of his philosophy that was either more palatable or more comprehensible than the true nature of his philosophy itself? In other words, is the TTP a mask, a cover for something else, or do such readings, not convince you at all?
Well, I think that there is definitely some writing between the lines in Spinoza. And the point is that they are pretty clear, I think, in most cases, what are the views that he is only alluding to rather than saying them out loud or spelling them out loud. I don't think that Strauss' reading of the TTP and of the ethics at all is of great value, because he is ascribing to Spinoza views which are, I don't know. Strauss reads Spinoza as an atheist and claims that all the proofs of the ethics are just some sort of crazy conspiracy theory trying to hide his atheism. And conspiracy theories, they have too much. Sometimes they are true. Most times they are just nonsense. In the case of Strauss, I think they are more than probably, they are just the regular nonsense. Strauss is unable to. I haven't seen anything intelligent written by Strauss on the ethics, the major work of Spinoza. The most he can say is that he is trying to hide his views, his true views, by presenting some sort of rational proofs for God's existence. Why present these proofs which are extremely new? They are not the proofs that you have in Descartes. They are not the proofs that you have in previous philosophers. There are proofs that actually are working not bad at all. What's the point of that, of this kind of very delicate proofs, if all Spinoza was supposed to do is just to have some sort of an appearance of an atheist? He could just repeat, repeat Aquinas, repeat Anselm, repeat Descartes, nothing more than that. He's not doing that. He's doing something very different. So I think that in the case of the interpretation of Strauss doesn't have even the haba amina of being seriously considered.
So I was sort of asking. Obviously Strauss is one example of let's say, conspiratorial or subterranean reading of Spinoza's TTP, but
and I think that there are subterranean things happening there. Again, there is definitely some level of esotericism. But what is cheap about Strauss is that all of this esotericism is just pointed out into one cheap direction of Athens against Jerusalem. I think that's not the story. The story is much more complicated.
Right. Interesting. So we spoke a little bit about Spinoza's background, his Jewish learning, and him learning Kabbalah, or at least imbibing Kabbalah to a certain degree, in his youth. There's another element of Spinoza's upbringing I wanted to ask with regard to his writings here in the TTP, which is that as part of the converso community. In other words, that this is well known that Spinoza came from a family whose I think his grandparents or grandparents' generation fled from the Iberian Peninsula, ended up in Amsterdam, and in general lived in Amsterdam, a place where the presence of very large numbers of conversos, of people who had lived as converted Christians, but then reverted to their Judaism decades or or even generations later. Do you see his works and specifically his TTP as part of this, as strongly informed, let's say, by this experience?
So I think the answer is it is likely to be the case, but we haven't studied that so far. I know that sounds bizarre, but you have some excellent works on the social construction of the Spanish Portuguese community in Amsterdam by Joseph Kaplan. But so far, just when you if we just look at, for example, at the kind of text that Spinoza was studying as a child, I mean, what were they? Who were the teachers? What were the texts that they were studying? All of this kind of stuff has been totally understudied. When you look even at the work of like Wolfson pays very little attention to the Amsterdam background of Spinoza, and it's pity. I mean, because it's pretty obvious that the Girsa de Enkuta is playing a certain role in his development. So it's a bizarre community. Many things that you would assume about other communities are not going to be true about Amsterdam, and it's a good idea to try to start studying these communities, start studying their Jewish lore, start studying their kind of spiritual life in order to see to what extent Spinoza was indeed responding or continuing some of these trends.
So it seems to be, in your view, that despite the enormous glut of Spinoza scholarship, from the last decades, they still need this part still needs to be unearthed.
Oh yeah, I think the Spinoza scholarship is in many ways pretty much just at the beginning. I mean, because in many ways there are text over text in Spinoza's in lines over lines in Spinoza's text in which we are reciting a certain formula, but we don't understand precisely what it is saying. And so many of these texts were just we begin questioning them over the past 10, 15, 20 years. So I think that we are there is amazing development, but there is a huge amount of work to be done, and especially also in the Jewish context, because the Dutch Jewish context, the kind of religious literature that was taught in Amsterdam in the years Spinoza was coming to age has been thoroughly understudied.
Interesting. I want to perhaps the last major question I'll pose to you today in this conversation is, we brought this up a little bit before, but I want to try and zero in on this to a certain degree, which is that the idea that Spinoza was writing primarily against Judaism and against the Hebrew Bible, and or attacking it in a certain way or trying to radically redefine it, but truly in the background, of course, was the major religion in which Spinoza lived, namely Christianity, and especially the forms of Christianity that were alive and well in the Dutch Republic in the late 17th century. So, I mean, to what degree? Let me phrase the question as follows: to what degree was Spinoza talking about Judaism, but really attempting to carry on a dialogue, or really attempting to comment on the Christian religion, which presumably he couldn't attack with the same level of freedom?
Of course not. I mean, and the issue is that it's clear that the TTP is written for Christian readers, not for Jewish readers. And Spinoza is sometimes using Christian tropes, sometimes even Christian anti-Semitic tropes, to denigrate Judaism. It is there. I don't think. I think that there are also some places where he's unfair towards the Jewish tradition. So, for example, he characterized the Hebrew state as based on strong xenophobia. And if you look at the Bible, if you read the Hebrew Bible, you don't have any kind of dread of passages asking you to care for the stranger, the Gale, and injunctions. I mean, 32, 34, I don't remember, but quite a few injunctions about your obligation to care for the stranger. This being said, I think that there is a complicated story there. My former teacher, beloved former teacher, Zev Harvey, suggested to me that perhaps Spinoza is projecting some elements from his community. Perhaps the Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish community had these kind of xenophobic tendencies, and Spinoza was just projecting them on the ancient Hebrews. I think that's an interesting suggestion. With regard to Christianity, he is extremely careful in thinking about trying to avoid trouble. I mean, he already got in trouble so he doesn't need a second condemnation. This being said, I can only invite our listeners to read Spinoza's last exchanges with the Oldenburg, some of his very last letters, wherein he is asked by Oldenburg to spell out his views about the nature of Christ, incarnation, etc., and have their own impression. I think that he's saying there are things which are more offending Christians than whatever kinds of offenses Jews had from the TTP. I think that what is happening in these late letters is far more significant. Again, if I'm right, Spinoza is basically telling there that Paul himself did not believe in the resurrection. That's quite bold.
It is, but of course, those letters were never meant for publication, which is probably why he felt licensed to be so.
There were by that time, I think people were thinking that it's possible they will be circulated, but I think that it may also have been the case that Spinoza knew that he is dying, that he has a few years to live. So I think he was less worried. So he at a certain point, towards the end of his life, he's becoming a bit. He's releasing his tongue, and then things are not going to appear so polite as in the TTP.
Fascinating. It seems to me, just from the general impressions I get from this conversation, is that you read Spinoza in a more, how can I say, you read Spinoza in a manner that is easier to reconcile with the Jewish tradition than many others do. In other words, many of Spinoza's readers, both in his own time and in the century since, have seen him as this great antagonist, this devil-like figure, whose whole point is to undermine all the major tenets of religion, including Judaism, and therefore is to be an anathema forever and ever. Whereas it seems to me that your reading, certainly of the TTP, puts Spinoza at least within the boundaries of something that we can recognize as Judaic, and actually fundamentally not a project that seeks to undermine and destroy, but to be part of the ongoing process of the Jewish discussion. Have I characterized your views correctly? And if so,
yes, I think Spinoza was. I think Spinoza was one of the most radical expressions of Jewish apikosuth. I personally have much sympathy for this great chain of apikosuth, because in many ways the history of apikosuth is the history of Judaism. So time and again, you see figures like Elisha ben Avoya, the Rambam, are basically the people that are creating the canon and at the same time undermining it. Now, with regard to Spinoza, I think there are some, again, I mentioned that there are some accusations that he brings against Judaism which I think are unfair. And of course, there is also some degree of personal animosity related probably to the cherem. We didn't have time to discuss that, but I think there are some issues there that might be related to that. All this being said, I think that the attitude that you see in Spinoza is always ambivalent. There are places, again, the text which we didn't have time to discuss. When you look at his compendium of Hebrew grammar, when he's just speaking about Hebrew, sometimes he will speak in first person plural, we, meaning how we, the Hebrews, are using certain words. Now, what to make of that, I don't know. All I'm saying is that I think there is a complex story here.
I think that may be as close as we can get to a fuller picture of Spinoza and his relation to Judaism. I suppose one last point before we go, which is something I asked many of my guests, which is as follows: if you had the opportunity to sit with Spinoza tonight for dinner, what are you asking him?
Good question. I need to have some time to think. I'm sorry.
Okay,
really?
Honestly, you could take a minute. I'm sure there's some burning issue that you're not sure what Spinoza meant or how exactly to. to pass the text.
Right. Well, I would ask him whether he thought that the TTP was a successful book, whether he was happy with the result. My suspicion is that the answer is no, but I think that again, I think that he recognized that the project that he was trying to pursue in this work failed. But that's my suspicion.
Right. I'd also be curious what he'd say about that, but anyway, if you get the opportunity, let me know. Professor Yitzhak Melamed, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. It has been a wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed having you, and I'm sure our audience will greatly benefit from the observations and the illumination you've shared on Spinoza's life and thought today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, JJ. It was a great pleasure.